Thanks for listening to the Mornings with Carmen LaBerge podcast, made available thanks to support from listeners just like you.
Helping you wake up, remembering this is our Father's world. This is Mornings with Carmen LaBerge on Faith Radio.
If we're gonna fly, we fly like eagles, arms out wide. If we're gonna fear, we fear no evil. We will rise. By your power, we will go. By your spirit, we are bold. If we're gonna stand, we stand as giants. If we're gonna walk, we walk as lions.
Well, good morning. Good morning. What does it mean for the hour to have come? I mean, the hour has come for you and I to sit down here, Mornings with Carmen, and spend time together to talk with one another, to get ourselves into the Word of God, to pray for one another. What does it mean for your hour to have come? Well, the hour has come. Have you ever had a particular time that you had to report somewhere for some particular thing? Maybe it was a medical procedure. I mean, the hour has come. Maybe it was, reporting for a period of time that you had to spend in prison. I mean, the hour has come. That point at which everything changes, and you know it's coming. You have an opportunity to anticipate it, and then it arrives. Today's reality in the life of Jesus is that the hour has come. John chapter 12, verses 23 to 25 are today's Growing Your Faith verses of the day. Jesus replied, "The hour has come. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly, I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Anyone who loves their life will lose it, while anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life." It's very early in the Gospel of John when we hear Jesus say, "My hour has not yet come." It's at the wedding at Cana, where he's having this conversation with his mom, and she's like, "They're out of wine. They've run out of wine." And he's like, "My hour's not yet come." That's in John chapter 2, verse 4. But he knew the end from the beginning. So Jesus knew the hour would come. And the fact that his hour was coming shaped from the very beginning where he went and what he did and what he said and how he taught and how he loved. Jesus is not yet here in John chapter 12 in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he is going to talk about his hour having come. But let's look at a few places where Jesus says, "My hour has not yet come." So John 2 at the wedding at Cana, but he says it again in John 7. "My time has not yet come." And then he begins preaching publicly, and it wasn't long before they're seeking to arrest him, but no one laid a hand on him. Why not? Because his hour had not yet come. Again, John chapter 7, verse 30. And then again in John chapter 8. Again, Jesus is in Jerusalem at this point, and he's teaching in the temple, but no one arrested him. And John explains again, because his hour had not yet come. Well, the hour is quickly approaching. And we read here in John chapter 12, during this Holy Week, Jesus knew at long last that, as in his own words, the hour has come. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, I tell you, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains but one seed, only a single seed. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. It produces many seeds. This is one of those opportunities to put an apple seed, on a napkin in the middle of the table, and talk about all of the apples that could be produced from that one seed. but only if you bury it. I want you to think today about how the life and death and resurrection of Jesus has produced generations of fruitfulness. I want you to think about the first disciples and the disciples who became disciples because of the first disciples. And from there, how you came to know Jesus. The hour has come. Now, once we arrive at the Garden of Gethsemane later this week, as we walk with Jesus during this Holy Week, Jesus is going to say right out loud, "My hour has come." The hour is approaching. And this is one of those walk with Jesus days and the walk with Jesus week that has some sobriety to it. It has some heft. It has some weight. And so maybe spend some time reflecting through the Gospel of John, all of the places where Jesus says, "My hour has not yet come." And then arrive today at John chapter 12, where he says the hour has come. Because certainly the hour is quickly approaching. Are you walking with Jesus during this Holy Week? I hope so. We want to invite you to read the Bible together with us during this Holy Week. It's a resource available at myfaithradio.com. Don't miss out. There's a study guide and a podcast. We want you to experience Holy Week with us as we walk with Jesus to the cross this week, so that we can stand together at the empty tomb this coming Sunday. But between here and there is still a great distance to cross. In fact, a cross. And I don't want you to miss out on any of it. Our friend Nick Pitts is going to join us next. We are going to reflect on something called the World Happiness Report. If I were to describe life as a ladder, and at the very bottom rung of the ladder is the worst possible circumstance that you could find yourself in. So whatever that is for you, whatever you imagine to be the absolute worst possible circumstance that you could face in life, that would be, a 1 on the ladder. And the best possible life you could imagine is the 10th rung of the ladder. Where would you say you are in terms of your sense of happiness? Now, of course, your definition of happiness is going to matter a lot, right? And so how satisfied are you with your life on a scale of 1 to 10, on a ladder of 1 to 10? How do you rate your own sense of happiness? You can text me, 877-933-2484. We're going to talk with Nick next about, what our neighbors are saying here and around the world. That's up next here on Mornings with Carmen. Happy day. Our friend Nick Pitts is here. He is a fellow at the Institute for Global Engagement. You can read what he's writing at thebriefing.net. Good morning, Nick.
Good morning, Carmen. Happy Tuesday to you.
Happy Tuesday. We could have a whole conversation about what happiness really is, but what is Gallup measuring in the World Happiness Report?
Yeah, what's fascinating is what's broke the news last week is that Gallup for 10 plus years has been kind of measuring over a variety of factors the happiness of countries. And what they have found is that the U.S., for the first time in the history of the report, which is, again, a little over 10 years, has fallen outside the top 20 countries relative to happiness. And so we're ranked at number 23. And so you can attribute this to a variety of different things. For example, our average age has gone up here in the U.S. And Jonathan Rauch has got an incredible book called The Happiness Curve that talks about how in life, generally speaking, according to his research, we tend to go through a big U-shaped curve relative to happiness, where the happiest points of our lives are at the beginnings and at the ends of our life. And that dip, usually in the middle age, tends to come largely due to it's just sheer amount of responsibilities that are put upon us. And Gallup kind of alludes to that when they mention how those born after 1980 are every year experiencing less and less happiness. But if we look at other research, it's pretty clear that there are some reasons for alarm here in the U.S. I'm basing a lot of what I've done off Arthur Brooks. He's just done an incredible work where he identifies that probably about 50% of happiness can be tied to genetics, but the other 50% can largely be tied to how we're positioning ourselves and how we're spending our days. And so that what he finds is that there's 4 categories that largely determine the happiness of that 50% that we are in control of relative to our lives. And what he found is that individuals that have strong family connections, strong friend connections, a sense of worldview, and a work, somebody's expecting you on Monday morning to show up. Those are the key metrics to determine whether someone will be happy relative to that 50% that we can control. And when you look across the U.S. right now, relative to broken home or relative to just estranged family members, when you look across the U.S. and you see the drastic downtick in the number of individuals that would say that they're lonely, that they have fewer friends over the past 25 years, span from sea to shining sea, we see engagement levels at work at record lows, according to Gallup. And then when you see just the number of individuals that are choosing to be religious nuns, aren't participating in the religious faith, it's no wonder that we're starting to see this downtick in happiness. Because while there are certain things that we cannot control relative to our genetics that's passed down to us, there are certain factors that we can control that can contribute greatly to our happiness. And Americans, by and large, are choosing not to engage with them.
Okay, those 3 markers are interesting. Not just strong family and friends, but just relationships in general. I just think of all of the places where we used to spend real time with other real people that we no longer even have minor engagements with other people because all of those engagements have been replaced by somebody dropping off something at my door as opposed to me and interacting with somebody to get it, or me doing self-checkout instead of even having the most minor of interaction that I would have had with a person who was, checking my groceries out, or going through the drive-through versus actually going into a restaurant. Those seem like, for convenience sake, we have actually given up even some of the loose ways that we used to engage with other people.
Oh, completely agree. We're by and large, we're starting to see a return back to work where more individuals are going back into the office, but we're still not at the pre-pandemic levels. And what you continue to see and what you've already alluded to is that increasingly it's just becoming cost prohibitive for companies to continue to employ certain employees, and so they're beginning to siphon those services off to self-checkout kiosks and other such technological advances, which in and of themselves aren't significant, but the accumulation of those things have a propensity to shape and to shift. And there are positive benefits, obviously, but there also are negative detriments, because such is life in a fallen world that we deal with just competing interests that happen in that regard.
So from a Christian and a biblical worldview, we would define happiness differently than many people would define it. I want to talk with you about that next. I want to talk about, our religious people, particularly people operating out of a Christian worldview. Are we, quote unquote, happier? And do we understand happiness as the pursuit of virtue, or which is, kind of the historical definition of it, or is it really just defined by my sense of satisfaction with myself and my life? So can we have those conversations next?
Of course, Carmen.
Great. That sounds so good. All right. Nick Pitts is here with us. We're talking about happiness. How would you answer the question on a scale of 1 to 10? How happy are you? And how would you be making that determination? Let me know. The text line is open, 877-933-2484. You're listening to Mornings with Carmen. Anne texted me, and then we had a conversation on the phone. She's 86 years old, and her husband, Bob, is 96. She listens to the podcast every single day, and she gets a lot of encouragement for her walk of faith in the midst of a life that has grown difficult and weary in many ways. Anne has a Faith Radio story, and so do you. If Faith Radio is a part of your daily journey with God, we'd love to hear your story. Share how God is using Faith Radio to encourage you and help you grow at myfaithradio.com. And who knows, maybe Anne will hear your story and be encouraged as well. Just in case nobody else has said it yet, good morning and I love you. All right, Natasha is checking in Wisconsin. I'm happy because I am a child of God's. Jesus bought me with his blood. Amen. I am right there with you, Natasha. Andrew is checking in this morning as well. We got another friend in the 860 area code checking in. It is a good morning because, well, God is a good God, and we're acknowledging him. Our friend Nick Pitts is here with us. He's a fellow at the Institute for Global Engagement. You can read what he's writing at thebriefing.net. We are talking about the World Happiness Report, which is something that Gallup does every single year. It's a huge global study. It's an opportunity for us to, just kind of check in on our neighbors around the world, but also check in on, the temperature of things right here at home. So, Nick, are religious people, are people of religious faith, happier?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's been a vast amount of research that's tried to answer that question, and there's reviews of research, which again is looking over a vast number of different studies to be able to determine that. And what they found is that religious people tend to be happier, but they can't make a connection towards, is religion the thing that's making them happier? Now, I would argue that for those that are following after Jesus, right, we believe it to be true from John 10:10 that he's offered us the invitation to live life to the fullest, and he's given us a life and a life of abundance. We know from 1 John 2 the realization that his commands to us aren't burdensome to us, but rather are a joy and a buoy to our soul. That God has instructed us in such a way that we might be able to live in obedience to him. And in turn, the maker of life wants us to get the most out of life. And so that way would lead to the fullness and what some might call happiness, the Bible might call blessed. So I would argue yes, but there would obviously be caveats toward that particular end.
When you think about happiness, how do you think most people are defining it? I think most people are defining it by some worldly, frankly, ridiculous standard versus a standard that we might find in the Bible, which might be a standard of joy or contentment or virtue or godliness or holiness. Right, I do think that the way that we define happiness is so culturally influenced that, maybe that's the starting point of conversation for most of us. How are you even defining it?
Yeah, Sean Achor has a great book out called The Happiness Advantage, and I really do owe a lot of my thinking relative to happiness toward him. And what he found, he kind of alluded to what you were referring to, in that many people define happiness as being in a particular position, right? The joy of being at your potential. But what he found in his research, and I don't know if Sean is a Christian, but I do know that he is leading a trail of breadcrumbs leading to the living bread, in that he defines happiness as the joy you feel growing towards your potential. And so it's not when you reach your potential that you're happy, but rather the pursuit of that potential in which you achieve happiness. And I think that there is something there. And I know that there is definitely, it reverberates for those that have ears to hear, right? Of being better today than yesterday, being better tomorrow than today. This understanding that we're moving from one degree of glory to the next, as Paul would say in his second letter to the Corinth church, right? I think that there is something when we're utilizing the gifts that he's given us, and but also that we're living in obedience to the commands that He has established for us, that we do experience a buoy to our souls. Because I'm not one of those individuals, Carmen, that's going to say that God doesn't want you to be happy, He wants you to be holy, right? I think that's a false dichotomy. I think God, you can be happy and you can be holy. I think God wants both of it. I think happiness moments remind us, though, that it's a good gift, that God reminds us that He's for us and He has good for us, right? And while I don't want to define God's goodness solely as our happiness, I do want to say happy moments do remind us of God's goodness in ways that unhappy moments don't.
That's so good. Shirley's on the text line. She says, faith, family, friends, worshiping, helping others, and my dog. Well, and in all caps. And in all caps, Faith Radio. There you go.
I believe it. I believe they're
Thank
good
you,
gifts.
Shirley, for that little nod. Andrew, we are waiting to know which dog we're walking this morning. Andrew says on the text line, Andrew's a dog walker, and every day he very dutifully sends me a picture of the dog we're walking during the show, and I delight in that. It's so delightful to me. So there you go.
Well, if Andrew wants to come down to Dallas and walk another dog, Freddie, but I just have to warn Andrew that Freddie does not walk. That you are walked by Freddie. He is the best bad dog you will ever meet. So he's a good boy that has.
Well, Freddie has nothing on Eddie. We are walking Eddie this morning, and Eddie is so cutie patootie. I don't know. He's like a little collie. I don't really know. He has a little bit of a collie, Thank you, Andrew, for that picture on the text line. The text line's open, people, 877-933-2484. I love that we're sharing this time together today. Nick, you and I have read these just heartbreaking statistics related to drug overdoses in the United States in 2022. Could you brief us in on this?
Yeah, unfortunately, what we're continuing to experience is simply a 20-plus year silent pandemic. One might even argue that it is, that's rippling across our country. In 2022, the latest numbers, we find that nearly 108,000 Americans died of drug overdoses. This is known as the fourth wave that we are in right now. The first being started approximately 1999, OxyContin prescriptions for non-cancer related pain increased up to 6.2 million in 22, and the number of deaths increased in that same period of nearly 9,000. That was the first wave. Now remember, in 2022, nearly 108,000 of Americans died of overdoses, and so in 2002 we had 9,000. That second wave hit 10 years later in 2010, and that involved more heroin becoming more prevalent. They surpassed opioid pills in 2015 relative to overdoses. And that third wave really centered on the illicitly manufactured fentanyl. And it again accounted for upwards of 28,000 deaths. And now we find ourselves in this third wave. And what's making this third wave so deadly is that we're seeing that drugs that were often seen as recreational and quote unquote harmless, even though we knew they were harmful, are being laced with dangerous other drugs that are in turn just causing tragic stories that are rippling across America.
Our hearts go out to each of you who have lost a family member to a drug overdose, not just in this past year, but in years past. Every single one of us has a story related to this, either within our own family or in, the circle of our friends. And so this is, when you see a headline like this, the first person who comes to mind, I want you to lift up a prayer for them, for their family, and I want you to reach out, send a text message. I guess I'm thinking right now about some friends in Virginia whose son, Nathan, took a lethal, combination of drugs after he was injured in a car accident. And my heart continues to break for them, for the life that he is not living, and for the way that that robs them of some joy every single day. And maybe you have somebody in your life like that. And so could you reach out to them today? Because these headlines, they pop, and when we see these huge numbers, more than 107,000 families just last year suffering in this particular way with this particular kind of loss. And so let's be the people who grieve with those who grieve. And this is a grief that never goes away. And if you've suffered it, you know that to be true. So just want you to know we're sensitive to that and walking with you today in prayer in the midst of that loss and that grief. Nick, as always, thank you so much for being with us.
So great to be with you, Carmen. Happy Tuesday.
Yeah, happy Tuesday. As we are walking with Jesus during this Holy Week, many of our conversations, center on places in the Holy Land. And so this is Holy Week in the Holy Land. But there aren't very many Christians visiting this year. Well, why is that? Well, there's an active war over who should live, who should possess the promised land. That is a land that has been contested for millennia. You just think about that. It's the only nation in the world where people who are Jewish, people who share the faith of the Messiah when he walked upon the earth, the only nation in the whole world where they're genuinely free to practice their faith without retribution in community with one another. It's the only Jewish nation in the world. And they are continually threatened by neighbors who want to annihilate them. So if you haven't been to Israel, it is really hard to appreciate how small and vulnerable the promised land really is. It's also difficult to appreciate just how different it is from all the nations that surround it. So Luke Moon joins us every couple of weeks, and it's been a couple of weeks since we talked with him. And in the interim, here in the United States, the Biden administration has renewed what are called Iran sanction waivers, which unlock about $10 billion for the Iranian regime, which operates not only against Israeli interests, but against American interests with impunity through their proxies of Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis. And since we last spoke with Luke, 19 Senate Democrats have begun pressuring the president to include the formation of a Palestinian state, which would have to be carved out of Israel, as a part of U.S. diplomatic policy in the region. And then yesterday, the United States, which was once considered Israel's best friend in the world, just sat on the sidelines and neglected to vote, stood aside, folded its arms, and abstained from voting when the UN Security Council approved a measure demanding that Israel stop fighting a war it did not start. And so we're going to talk about all of that next. But during this Holy Week, the Holy Land is a place of political tension, warring worldviews, and bloodshed. It's really not unlike the reality of the days in which Jesus lived and walked and died there. So let's talk with Luke Moon, the executive director of the Philos Project, next. You're listening to Mornings with Carmen. Luke Moon is joining us. He's the executive director of the Philos Project, also a contributor at Providence Magazine. Good morning, Luke.
Good morning, Carmen.
So let's not start with the bad news. Let's start with walking with Jesus in the Old City during Holy Week. You have been there and literally done that. So take us on a walk in the steps of Jesus in the week that leads up to his crucifixion.
Yeah, no, it's Palm Sunday was on Sunday, and Jesus comes into the city on a donkey, and I've over most of my life I've read that story as in he could have come on a horse, but he came on a donkey, and I actually read this last week that it was actually normal for a king to come into a city on a donkey if he had conquered that city. So if he was like, oh, this is already my city, he would come in on a donkey, because if he came in on a horse, he was looking to conquer that place. And so he comes into the city as the already victorious king, which is awesome to me. and then things go south a bit. Once he is then the apostles come together and they have a big feast, and then they go down into the Garden of Gethsemane. That's where Jesus is arrested. He is brought to meet with different leaders. And one of the things I find interesting about that moment is that in Greek history there's three major forms of government, right? The monarchy, where it's rule of one. You have the aristocracy, where it's basically the rich rule, and then you have democracy, which is where it's what we have, which is basically the poor rule. But Jesus, on the night that he was arrested, actually confronts all the major political structures of the world, because Pilate, representing Rome at the time was still a republic. They had a senate and things. So it basically offers a democracy, offers the people in Jerusalem, do you choose? Do you vote for Barabbas or do you vote for Jesus? Right? And they actually voted to kill Jesus. Jesus confronts the leaders, the Sanhedrin, the 70 that were running the Jewish people at the time. And they were basically the aristocracy. And he confronts them. He confronts them on their power. They had no power. And then he also goes before Herod, who is the appointed king, if you will, of Israel at the time. And what does Jesus say to Herod? Nothing. Because what does a true king have to say to a fake one? Nothing. And then they start to walk in the old city. In the old city, you can walk it today. You start, where Jesus was whipped and put a crown on his head, and then you can go through the stations of the cross. And at every, it's really interesting. Every point in which Jesus falls, because he falls several times along his walk, is actually a point in which a street meets another street. So he has to turn a corner, and it's hard. It's hard to turn the corner. And as a result of that, he falls several times along his walk. And as you're walking through the old city, you go from, there's a point in which, Jesus is, he's having a hard time. You got Simon Serene coming to help him out. But then he's put up on on Golgotha, the place of the skull. It's interesting that you can see it today. This is the place where most historians and archaeologists believe that the death and resurrection happened, crucifixion happened, is in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Which at the time was a quarry. And so what they would quarry all the good stone to make stuff, stuff for building. And there was the Golgotha was actually in the quarry, but it was stone that was useless for building. Right? It was crumbly. It was not, so the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, right? Because it's on that stone, on the stone that the quarry masters were like, it can't be used for anything. That's the stone upon which Jesus was crucified. And then there's a slab of rock upon which he is after his death, after he's brought down from the cross, he is prepared for burial. And then the tomb, Joseph Arimathea's tomb. One of the things that people wonder is, well, how come, it's now, it's not as it was, if you will. And it's because if you were a pilgrim in, let's say, the year 400, and you are a follower of Jesus and you want to go to the place where his empty tomb, what you do is you would take a chisel and you would take a chunk off the rock, And over 1,000 years, thousands and thousands and thousands of people would take a piece of rock with them back from the Holy Land of the place where Jesus was crucified. And eventually, there was nothing left of that tomb except for the place where it happened. Yeah, I don't know. It's an amazing place to walk at any time of the year, but to be in that place where you put your hand in the place where the cross was laid. I've seen grown men weep as they stand in that place and look at what our Savior did for us at that moment, and it's powerful.
We think about this taking place in a very, very densely populated urban environment with very narrow streets and sharp turns. Jesus being led through these very busy streets for maximum humiliation, happening during Passover. So Jerusalem would have been really, really busy, something like 150,000 people probably present at the time, bleeding, weak, carrying his cross. It's there's a part of us that wishes it looked more like it looked then. Obviously the first stop on the Via Dolorosa today is no longer a Roman, it's no longer the Antonia Fortress of Roman days. It's now a Muslim elementary school, and you have to get special permission even to be in the courtyard. So I just think that when we think about the ways in which the old city of Jerusalem has changed, when we think about the circuitous path that's laid out, the Via Dolorosa, this is not a simple journey today even to make, and it would have been very, very difficult in the days of Jesus, and painful and humiliating, excruciating even. And so thank you for taking us there today during this Holy Week. I want to spend some time talking with you about the events unfolding in Israel in these days and global events related to Israel. But let's take a very brief break and just ponder for a moment as you're thinking about walking in the steps of Jesus during this Holy Week. What it really would have been like to walk with him on the way to the cross. We're talking with Luke Moon. He's the executive director of the Philos Project. We'll continue our conversation in just a moment. You're listening to Mornings with Carmen. As we consider the life of Jesus and the life of the first generation of Christians, reading here the book of Acts and all the letters to the Christians in the New Testament, we see people who wake up. They come to see and understand and then receive Jesus as their Savior and Lord. And it changes everything. We see Christians then telling other people about the good news and inviting them to respond in repentance, be baptized, and follow Jesus. The movement of Christianity grows person by person and then exponentially as people walking in darkness receive the light of Christ and want others to know what they know and have what they have. Well, you and I are living in dark days. People need light. And Jesus is the light of the world today in the same way that he was the light of the world at the beginning of creation and at the first Christmas and throughout his life on earth and in his radiance now at the right hand of the Father. Jesus is the light of the world. So if you're walking in darkness of any kind today, I invite you to consider Jesus. If you'd like to know more about what it means to begin a relationship with Christ or to chat with someone about it, just text the word faith to 41224. Continuing our conversation with Luke Moon. He's the executive director of the Philos Project. All right, Luke, just yesterday, the UN Security Council passed a Gaza ceasefire resolution, and the United States of America folded its arms and stood aside and did not vote, did not veto it. Like we could have used our power, which we've done in the past. I find that strange for the greatest democracy in the world to not exercise its right to vote. That doesn't bode well. And in response, the prime minister of Israel has canceled canceled a trip that was planned
Yeah.
in our direction. So just give us a sense of the temperature of things. Those hostages have now been held for a really long time. There's increasing concern about, how many of them might even still be alive. Just give us a sense of things now.
Yeah, I mean it's appalling. It's one of the since I've been with Philos, last 10 years, there was a point at the end of the Obama administration where the U.S. withheld a veto again that was also against Israel. Strangely, it seems like we're most quick to hold our withhold our support. Most of the time we're good allies to Israel, but they get these moments where it's like yesterday, where any resolution for ceasefire at this moment is saves Hamas, and Hamas is an aggressor body. It's a terrorist body that continues to declare its intent to destroy Israel, to kill Jews. Even yesterday, after the expectation was, if we don't vote for, or if we don't abstain, if we don't support this resolution that was at the Security Council, Hamas will walk away from the negotiating table in Qatar, and will lose the opportunity to get the hostages back. Well, they voted. The U.S. abstained. The resolution passed. Hamas walked out of the room and then launched rockets at Israel yesterday. Literally yesterday, launched rockets at Ashdod, which is one of the towns along the coast with Israel, in Israel, and that's what Hamas does. And it seems like we are led by people that do not understand the evil of Hamas, or at least they seem to be totally fine with it or something. It's really appalling to me. I mean, no, you can't imagine, like, if there was a resolution calling for ceasefire between Russia, in support of Russia from, with Ukraine, like the U.S. would like hold back on that. It's absurd. And yet here we are. And it really is quite appalling to me. And it's also, we're still in this point where, the U.S. administration does not want Israel to go into Rafah. We've had that conversation a couple of times. Rafah is basically the last holdout of Hamas in Gaza, and it's a matter of time before Israel goes in. And when they go in, they will find the hostages themselves, and they will, unfortunately, probably at that point, most of them will have been killed. But there's a point at which this is going to no longer. Israel is just going to do what Israel has to do, and my hope is that Christians continue to show resolve in support of Israel, recognizing that the evil done against the Jews will be done against the Christians next. It's so surprising to me that Russia, coming off its own terrorist attack in its own backyard, is standing with Islamists against Israel. It's a strange thing to me. It's almost like in moments like this, Carmen, I'm so ready to see there being a very deeply spiritual nature to all this work.
Yeah. I think the word Zionism is one that comes up frequently. I would appreciate if you would tell us how you define that word. I mean, there's sort of Zionism that's political, and then there's Zionism that maybe is Christian in addition to being a Zionism that is expressly Jewish. Can you just Can you just brief us in on what do you, how do you understand that term?
Well, I understand it in several ways. I mean, obviously political Zionism is, basically the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people and the Jewish people living in that homeland with self-determination, and that's classic old, just regular old Zionism. I actually think that I go to the Bible. To me, Isaiah 2, I love Isaiah 2. It says, the nations shall go up to the mountain of the Lord. They will learn of the God of Jacob. The word will go forth the law will go forth from Zion, the word of the Lord to the end of the earth. And then it goes on and talks about how we will, that God will judge between nations, and we will turn our plows or swords into plowshares and our spears into pruning hooks. That picture to me of as I see it, the biblical Zionism is that the nations, the Gentiles of the world, people like me and you, go up and we learn of the God of Jacob. We learn of this God that we read about in the Old Testament, and we recognize that God put a blueprint on this earth for how humans should flourish. And once we recognize that God and that blueprint, that's when we begin to see the transformation of the world, because we actually, left to our own devices, we would have never discovered that we should not hate other nations and other races and other people, right? Like, we learn that everybody's made in the image of God because of that book that says everybody's made in the image of God. And we recognize Jesus is the Messiah of the whole world, the King of the whole world, and also recognize, I think, that God still has a special place, a special role for the people that are currently living on Mount Zion, the city of the Lord, the city of the great King.
That's so good. That's so helpful. I think that defining terms and being able to say what we mean when we use a term is really, really helpful. And so thank you for walking with us in that. As always, Luke, thank you for walking with us in the conversations of the day. We genuinely appreciate it.
Of course. My pleasure.
That's Luke Moon. You can find him at the Philos Project, where he serves as the executive director, philosproject.org, also writing at providencemag.com. All right, when we talk about walking with one another in the days in which we live, the news of the day is often jolting and jarring. And so we want to be people of peace in the midst of a world on fire. We want to be people of light in the midst of very dark days. We want to be the people who know where the story leads. And so even as Luke is talking there about Isaiah chapter 2, I'm wondering how you are reading the Old Testament in these days. Where are you in the Word of God as we have these conversations about Jesus as the Messiah and the unfolding events of Holy Week? Are you spending time in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament? As we're walking with Jesus, you can't help but recognize as he expresses himself from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? You can't help but hear the entirety of Psalm 22 as Jesus is saying that. And so let's listen with ears that hear this week, and let's listen with a really open heart to all of the prophecies fulfilled in the person of Christ, particularly during this most holy of weeks. Are you walking with Jesus? I hope so. Thank you for walking with me this morning. You're listening to Mornings with Carmen. I'm Carmen LaBerge. We have another hour up next. Thanks for listening to Mornings with Carmen LaBerge. Podcasts like this are available because of your support. If it's important to you to hear things that encourage your faith, click the link in the show notes to give now. And thanks.